Chapter 27 of Acts is one of the most dramatic chapters in the Scriptures, an eyewitness account of a most horrific storm. Paul has been put into the custody of Julius, a centurion of the Augustan cohort, to transfer him to Rome, where he would stand before Caesar. Luke and Aristarchus, Paul's associates, are also travelling with them. They got as far as the town of Fair Havens in Crete, but with great difficulty, for it was a wild autumn. And Paul's advice was, stay put. Otherwise the ship will be lost, the cargo will be lost, and you will be lost. But the majority said, this is a terrible place to camp. We'll move up the coast a little. When the south wind blew softly, supposing they had obtained their desire, putting out to sea, they sailed close by Crete. But not long afterward a tempestuous headwind arose, called Euroclydon. So when the ship was caught and could not head into the wind, we let her drive, and running under the shelter of an island called Clauda, we secured the skiff with difficulty. When they had taken it on board, they used cables to undergird the ship, and fearing lest they should run aground on the Syrtis sands, they struck sail, and so were driven. And because we were exceedingly tempest-tossed, the next day they lightened the ship. On the third day they threw the ship's tackle overboard with our own hands. Now when neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small tempest beat on us, all hope that we should be saved was finally given up. But after long abstinence from food, then Paul stood in the midst of them and said, Men, you should have listened to me, and not have sailed from Crete, and incurred this disaster and loss. And now I urge you to take heart, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. For there stood by me this night an angel of the God to whom I belong, and whom I serve, saying, Do not be afraid, Paul. You must be brought before Caesar. And indeed God has granted you all those who sail with you. Therefore take heart, men, for I believe God that it will be just as it was told me. However, we must run aground on a certain island. Now when the 14th night had come, as we were driven up and down in the Adriatic Sea, about midnight, the sailors sensed that they were drawing near some land, and they took soundings and found it to be 20 fathoms. And when they had gone a little further, they took soundings again and found it to be 15 fathoms. Then, fearing lest we should run aground on the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern, and prayed for day to come. And as the sailors were seeking to escape from the ship, when they had let down the skiff into the sea, under pretence of putting out anchors from the prow, Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, Unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved. Then the soldiers cut away the ropes of the skiff, and let it fall off. And as the day was about to dawn, Paul implored them all to take food, saying, Today is the 14th day you have waited, and continued without food, and eaten nothing. Therefore I urge you to take nourishment, for this is for your survival, since not a hair will fall from the head of any of you. And when he had said these things, he took bread and gave thanks to God in the presence of them all. And when he had broken it, he began to eat. Then they were all encouraged, and took food themselves. And in all we were 276 persons on the ship. So, when they had eaten enough, they lightened the ship, and threw out the wheat into the sea. When it was day, they did not recognize the land, but they observed a bay with a beach, onto which they planned to run the ship, if possible. And they let go the anchors, and left them in the sea. Meanwhile, loosing the rudder ropes, they hoisted the mainsail to the wind, and made for shore. But striking a place where 2 seas met, they ran the ship aground, and the prow stuck fast and remained immovable. But the stern was being broken up by the violence of the waves, and the soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners, lest any of them should swim away and escape. But the centurion, wanting to save Paul, kept them from their purpose, and commanded that those who could swim should jump overboard first and get to land, and the rest, some on boards and some on parts of the ship, and so it was that they all escaped safely to land. My name's Arthur, and I thank you for joining me as we share together this dramatic storm and the way that Paul held his nerve, held his trust, prayed to the Lord, fasted to the Lord, and the Lord granted his request. But the Lord granted his request because the Lord had a purpose for Paul, to stand before Caesar. Paul was travelling with Luke and Aristarchus, but he was a prisoner in the custody of Julius, a centurion of the Augustan cohort. Augustus was Caesar at this time. So this centurion was directly under the authority of Caesar. He was in that division of the army that was Caesar's own division. At the beginning of the journey, Julius recognizes Paul as a significant prisoner, but he doesn't know the God of Paul. And so when Paul had given the advice, I perceive that this journey will end with disaster of the cargo, of the ship, and of the lives on the ship, he had rather listened to the majority, who said, "This is a terrible place. We shouldn't spend winter here. If we get a chance, let's move up the coast a little bit and find a more congenial harbour." So the majority prevailed. Paul was overruled, and they had set sail on a nice, quiet morning. But no sooner were they out of the harbour than the storm commenced. They had just been lured out of the harbour. I guess at one level we can see that Satan would have loved to have destroyed Paul at this point in time, and he had no qualms about destroying the whole ship and everything else in the process. And Paul's experience in travelling, having already been shipwrecked 3 times, having spent 24 hours lost at sea, he could see the absolute foolishness of undertaking this journey. But the majority prevailed. It wasn't long before they realised they were in big trouble. But none of them realised how much trouble. Surely the storm would be over in a few days. No, surely it wouldn't last a week. No, it kept going. It was horrendous for 2 weeks, 14 days, during which time they didn't eat. They'd thrown much of the cargo overboard. They'd had to put cables under the ship to hold it together. All hope that we should be saved was finally given up. Of course, we know everything ends, but when we're in the midst of a storm that goes on, we wonder maybe that rule will be broken. But at the end, Paul urges the people to have hope. He says, "The God whom I serve has told me you must be brought before Caesar." This was the whole purpose of the journey, and it was God's purpose that Paul stand before Caesar. And Paul had prayed for his journeymen, and the Lord had granted them as well. But they needed even more evidence of the power and might of God. While the ship would be lost, and the cargo lost, every soul would be saved. The sailors didn't trust. They tried to escape. But Paul said to the centurion, "Don't let those men escape. We need them." The soldiers prevented the sailors escaping. Then the soldiers said, "Oh, we're in trouble. If we survive and any of the prisoners escape, we should kill the prisoners." But Julius overrules them. The ship runs aground, and they all escape. Those who could swim would swim. Those who couldn't swim would hold a plank of wood and float. But they all escaped safely to land.